Hi there. In this video, I'll show you how to create hair in Yeti. I'm using version 5 of the plugin. If you're working with an older version, some interface elements may look different. The main goal of this video is to show how the fur creation process is built step by step in a short format, without going into too much detail. Quick and practical demos like this are actually quite rare. In future videos, I'll take a deeper look at using attributes, textures, expressions, and more, since many nodes require separate explanation. Let's start with references. I'm planning to make a round character. Its face will look like felt, while the body will be covered with tufts of fur. I've selected a few reference images that closely match this idea. Next, the model. When modeling, it's important to aim for an even, mostly square topology and avoid triangles whenever possible. When unwrapping the UVs, especially for the shells where the fur will grow, make sure they have roughly the same textile density. Otherwise, it can be really tricky to balance fur density and transitions between UV seams. The next step is creating geometry sets that define where the fur will grow. This will make it easier to adjust things later if you need to make changes.
Now, let's move on to groom. Groom means creating guides that define the length and direction of the hair or fur. In my case, I'll keep the face short and felt-like, while the body will have larger tufts that gradually taper toward the face. To create a groom, first select the geometry. Then click the GRM button under the Yeti tab in the Maya panel. Next, in the attribute editor, and activate Edit Groom. Then, in the Strands section, I disable vertex snapping when creating the groom and enable the option called Conform New Strands. After that, I start drawing the guides. Thanks to the settings I've applied, I can kind of clone the shape of the existing guides. First, I create the guides on one half of the model. Then I adjust their shape, and reduce the size of the ones closer to the face. At the final stage, I check if there are any empty spaces left between the guides. In this case, it helps to ensure smoother interpolation of the fur clumps. Once all corrections are done, I apply symmetry to the guides. And that's it. The groom is ready. Let's move on to fur creation. We'll start by sketching out the fur on the body. The Yeti Maya node controls the fur parameters on the character. To create it, select the geometry and click the CRM button in the Maya panel. Next, with the Yeti Maya node selected, open the graph editor by clicking the GE button in the Maya panel. Then, in the attribute editor, under Graph, Input Groom, add the groom that we created earlier. By the way, Input geometry already contains the correct mesh since we selected it beforehand. Now, let's start with a basic node chain. Import loads the geometry and the groom. Scatter controls the density. Grow takes length from the groom, or you can set it manually. Comb defines the direction using the groom. Clump creates and shapes clumps. For clump control, it's better to create a separate chain: scatter, grow, comb. This makes it easier to adjust clump count later on. Scraggle adds variation and irregularity to the strands. Width controls strand width. In this workflow, I didn't use cut textures, but I did use expressions and groom attributes. While working on the clumps, I needed a transition from more dense clumps to fewer ones since my character has a face. To achieve that, I created a density clump attribute and continued adjusting the scatter node for the clumps, connecting the second input, the density mask, from the import groom node. For a smoother clump profile, you can also add a curve node. After setting up the main clumps, I moved on to working with the undercoat. Since part of the logic was already there, I simply duplicated part of the node chain and adapted it for a different type of fur. Most changes were made to density, length, and shape. Next, I added some waviness to the clumps using the bend node and expressions. During this kind of setup, I like to use a shader node to visualize how the structure is changing in the viewport, or to enhance surface definition, sometimes with the curve node, since a single flat color isn't always helpful when working in the viewport. Then, I decided to add a few stray hairs, based on the fur that was already created. I added a transform node to scale them up slightly. Then used a bend node and continued adjusting the stray hairs. That's it. The body pass is complete. Now let's move on to the fur setup for the face. So, I'm copying a fragment of an existing node chain. But in this setup, I'm not using the groom to drive direction or length. Instead, I set the length directly in the grow node. In this case, the comb node isn't needed, but after copying the chain, I forgot to remove it. Since the character's face should look like felt, I start by twisting and crumpling the hairs using the scraggle node.
then curl the guides with clump. And finish by bending the tips using bend. This gives a cleaner look. Now I'm moving on to render preparation. There are many ways to assign materials to fur, but in this workflow, I went with one material and one Yeti node. I create an attribute in the graph editor, ID part, which will be passed to the render and used to define different fur types on the character. Then in the attribute editor on the Yeti Maya node, I set the same global density for both viewport and render. I switch the display mode to display and render and set AI min pixel width to 0.3. Next, I set up a camera, adjust the focal length and overscan, frame the character, and assign the material. I prefer to configure all the rendering settings for a cartoony character up front, but you can start rendering right away and fine-tune things gradually. The main thing is to understand what you're doing. Rendering settings. I'll be rendering in Arnold. I set the resolution to 2K, and camera AA to 4. Keep in mind, this may introduce noise, but it speeds up rendering during early look and dev passes. Lighting. I usually use an HDRI map with soft studio lighting to avoid colored light leaks or harsh shadows. It's important to achieve a clean, neutral lighting environment. The goal is to keep the material from burning out or becoming too dark due to lighting. This approach is more production-friendly than tuning for a single still shot. The material might appear a little dull at first, but it gives you more flexibility later in comp and color correction. So, we get the first render. There are some issues. The hair is a bit too thick,
some longer strands poke into the face, and the color isn't quite what I was going for. Groom adjustment during rendering is always a challenge. Sometimes the computer freezes, sometimes Maya crashes entirely. So I highly recommend saving often and cleaning up the scene when you're done. I adjusted the color slightly and fixed the transition from the longer hairs to the face. I launched another render. It looked better, but I still needed to tweak the settings for the face. For now, I just adjusted the thickness. Next, I wanted to match the fur color with the base geometry color. Then I moved on to adjusting how clumps are displayed. In short, I didn't like that the clumps looked stuck together and too thick, so I tweaked that, running test renders regularly to compare the result. After making adjustments to the face, I noticed the hairline became too visible. To fix this, I added a separate groom and painted the growth attribute manually for the face area. It was tricky to blend at first, but in the end, it worked. I just had to slightly expand the geometry set for the face to give space for a softer transition. Next, color setup for each fur type. I added AI color jitter to randomize color per strand, AI switch to distribute color based on the attribute we created earlier, AI flat for constant base, colors that can be mixed with ramps, or AI layer RGBA. I also added a randomization attribute in the graph editor. For color tuning, I usually switch to the AOV diffuse view. It's the fastest way to see results. Then I always check the final look in the beauty pass. And finally, I launch the render and wait for the final image. This is the result I got. Thank you for watching this video until the end. Grooming is a meticulous process that takes effort from both the artist and the machine. So let's give a like and hit that bell to show some love to our tireless render workhorse. It keeps going all night while we rest and recharge. I hope you found something helpful in this tutorial. I'll definitely keep sharing my experience and workflow in Yeti. If you're interested in grooming and Yeti, I'd be happy to see you on my professional pages. Links are in the description. See you next time.